They called me a disappointment behind polite smiles and champagne glasses, though rarely to my face, at least not at first. In my family, cruelty came wrapped in formality. The Hart name carried weight, power, legacy. At every dinner, every fundraiser, every glossy family portrait hung in the halls of our estate, I was reminded of what I had failed to become. The heir they wanted, the leader I never was in their eyes anyway. My father, Richard Hart, founded Hartwell & Sons International from the ground up, or so he told everyone who'd listen. A self-made man, they'd say, conveniently forgetting the seed money came from my grandfather's inheritance. My mother, Elaine, wore elegance like armor, her judgment embedded in every comment, laced with sugar. And then there were my siblings, Alexander the Golden Son, with his Ivy League MBA and tailored suits, and Madeline the Prodigy turned VP before 30, always 3 steps ahead in stilettos and spreadsheets. And then there was me, Evelyn, the creative one, the black sheep, the former director of innovation who resigned 3 years ago. They said I cracked under pressure. Truth is, I suffocated under their expectations. They wanted obedience, not brilliance. So I left, and they never forgave me for that. The Winter Gala was the kind of event people wrote about in business magazines, lavish, cold, and full of masks, both literal and metaphorical. I arrived in a plain black dress with no designer label, no arm candy, just me. I wasn't on the guest list. Madeline had forgotten she said, or maybe she hadn't. I ended up seated at the far end of the massive dining table. No nameplate, just silence and crystal glasses. The servers didn't know where to place my wine. The photographer didn't bother asking me to smile. I listened as Alexander bragged about quarterly margins and offshore expansions. Globalization at scale, he said, like a TED Talk with a Rolex. My mother nodded proud. My father raised his glass to the next generation of true leadership. Then his eyes fell on me like a footnote. Evelyn, he said smoothly, still doing that. What is it? Consulting strategy advisory, I answered calmly. Remote teams, digital firms, mostly overseas. He chuckled. So, freelancing. My sister chimed in, smirking. Well, if you ever get tired of working from your laptop, there's always something in marketing, or even HR. Her voice dipped like she was offering me charity. I smiled, not because I found it funny, but because I knew something they didn't. Alexander leaned across the table. While some of us wear suits to the office, he said others prefer pajamas, I guess. Laughter followed. None from me. Just silence. The kind that fills the space before a storm. I didn't lose my family. I lost the illusion of it. The illusion that love wasn't conditional, that being a Hart meant being accepted. They didn't want a daughter. They wanted a successor, and when I didn't fit the mold, they exiled me with backhanded blessings and strategic neglect. So I sat through dinner, nodding, smiling, bleeding into my palm from where my nails had pierced my skin beneath the tablecloth. I remember looking at my father as he raised another toast to tradition, to legacy, to power, and realizing they would never respect me until I built something they couldn't ignore. That night, I walked the garden alone. Rain threatened above, but I welcomed it. The estate behind me glowed like a cathedral of arrogance. I passed the fountain where Alexander once pushed me as a child. The hedge, where Madeline told me I'd never be strong enough to lead. My heels sank in the grass. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. At home, I opened the drawer I hadn't touched in 2 years. Inside was a leather-bound notebook, my war map. Plans, timelines, a portfolio of shell companies, a chart of Hartwell & Sons corporate vulnerabilities. Passwords I shouldn't know, a list of allies who didn't know they were helping me yet. At the top of the first page, in red ink, Project Blackthorn. It started as an idea, then a hobby, then a strategy. Now it was a machine, and I was weeks away from launching it. They called me a failure. Tomorrow they'll call me boss. But before that, before I take the seat at the head of the table, they told me I was unworthy of one thing had to happen. Something irreversible. I picked up my phone. One message blinked from a secured channel. Target asset vulnerable. Window 72 hours. Do you want to proceed? I stared at the message heart thudding. Then I tapped yes. And in that moment, I stopped being Evelyn the disappointment. I became Evelyn Hart, the storm they'd never see coming. But what I didn't know was that someone had been watching. Someone close. Someone who remembered things I'd forgotten. And they had plans of their own. I had given the order. As soon as the word yes disappeared from the screen, my phone entered full encryption mode. The screen went dark. A padlock icon pulsed like a silent heartbeat. There was no turning back now. I had pulled the trigger. It was 3:47 a.m. I was sitting on the hardwood floor of my living room, surrounded by color-coded files, printed data sheets, organizational maps of Hartwell & Sons, and encrypted messages blinking from secure channels. I couldn't even remember the last time I slept more than 6 hours in a row. Since the day I walked away from my family's empire, I didn't just quit. I vanished. Not to run, to prepare. Over the past few years, I watched them from the shadows. Every move, every cover-up, every desperate grasp at relevance masked as innovation. Alexander had signed off on risky ventures just to prove his boldness. Madeline tried to pivot into tech she didn't understand. I had copies of internal memos they believed were destroyed, images of documents hidden in vaults, names of executives they trusted who secretly confided in me. I knew how the empire breathed, and I knew where it was beginning to rot. That night, I stood by the window, staring out at a sleeping city. Just a few blocks away stood the glass tower of Hartwell 38 stories, tall a monument to their pride. But I didn't see strength. I saw cracks, weak points, blind spots. I peeled off a note from the edge of my warboard. It read, Target 1 cut secondary funding. Beneath it, the name of a dummy corporation used to funnel backup capital into Hartwell projects, one I'd quietly acquired months ago under 3 layers of anonymous holding firms. Tonight, I would freeze that account. They wouldn't notice right away. Not yet. You don't collapse a fortress by ramming the front gate. You remove one stone from the foundation at a time. At 5:12 a.m., I stood across the street from the tower. Not a single soul was there yet, not even security. The Hartwell building loomed against the indigo sky like a frozen relic of my past. I stared at it and remembered the conference room where I'd been questioned for being too emotional, the elevator where Madeline once whispered that I didn't look like a leader. But today, my hands didn't shake. I wasn't here for validation. I was here for victory. I initiated a secure video call with a man in Tokyo, the CEO of a capital firm I had quietly partnered with last week. A contract had been signed, one that, if Hartwell discovered in time, could unravel 1/3 of their voting class shares. It's time, I said. He nodded. The transaction will complete within 48 hours. After that, you'll hold 12.3% of voting stock. I ended the call and exhaled slowly. Another piece of the puzzle locked into place. Back home, I played an old video footage of myself giving a corporate presentation during my Hartwell years. My voice wavered a little, but my gaze was sharp. I remembered that day clearly. After the meeting, Alexander clapped me on the back and said, "Well done, Evelyn. But you're not really the kind of person people follow." I smiled even then, pretending it didn't cut me open. I don't need followers anymore. I'm not building a movement. I'm leading a reckoning. I pulled out my old employee ID card, Director of Innovation, Evelyn Hart. I slid it into the shredder, watched the pieces scatter like black confetti. A silent funeral for a title I never truly owned. Later, as I stepped into the elevator of a rented office tower, a temporary HQ for my real operations, I caught my reflection in the mirrored doors. 2 versions of me stared back. The Evelyn they left behind, and the one rising quietly in the background. The doors closed, but just as I opened my laptop, a message appeared. Not encrypted, no name, just one line. "You're not the only one playing this game, Evelyn." I froze. Someone had seen me. Someone was ahead, and I had no idea who. The message still burned on my screen like it had weight. "You're not the only one playing this game, Evelyn." I stared at it for a long time, not because I didn't understand, but because I did. Someone was watching me. Someone who knew what I was building. Worse, someone who knew who I was. I reopened every secure server, no breach, no forced entry. Whoever this was, they weren't trying to break in. They already had access, or worse, permission. That night, I barely slept. I kept replaying every step of the past 3 years, every silent move, every hidden acquisition. And still, somehow, someone had stayed ahead of me, which meant only one thing. They were close, very close. I returned to the old Hart family archives, a locked room inside my father's estate library. I still had the key. No one thought to revoke it. Inside were decades of files, board minutes, contracts. But one folder stood out. Not because of its label, it had none, but because it had been placed backwards, tucked behind legal documents as if someone meant to forget it, but didn't dare destroy it. It was filled with correspondence letters between my father and an unknown account labeled simply EH. My initials, but the handwriting wasn't mine. It was elegant slanted, unmistakably hers. My mother. Letter after letter, she detailed strategy suggestions, reputation plays shadow acquisitions, things far more cunning than anything I imagined she was capable of. This wasn't the woman who sat at the dinner table, smiling faintly at my remote job. This was a woman who once orchestrated the suppression of a board rebellion behind closed doors and succeeded. I was stunned. She'd always played the doting socialite, supportive but always distant, sweet but condescending. But these letters, she was far more dangerous than I gave her credit for. One line struck me like a blade. Richard must never know I backed that transfer. Let him think it was Dominic. Safer that way. Dominic, Vale, the man who vanished, the man I thought my father betrayed. But what if it wasn't him my father buried? What if it was her betrayal he never discovered? I stood outside her private study 2 nights later, hidden in the dark hallway. I heard her voice, soft, calm, speaking on the phone. No, she doesn't suspect. Evelyn still thinks I'm just watching. Pause. She's sharp, but she's still her father's daughter. Predictable. The blood in my body turned to ice. That night, I walked the city alone. No plans, no expectations. But for the first time, I wasn't afraid, because now I knew the game wasn't between me and my father. It was between me and the woman who taught me to smile while sinking the knife. My mother. That night didn't end. It just unraveled. I spent it walking not just through streets, but through memory. Through every silent dinner where my mother sipped her wine and said nothing while father tore into me. Through every social event where she smiled and nodded as others joked about my career, my choices, my quietness. I thought it was apathy. I thought she was simply cold. But maybe it was strategy. I returned home with a question I couldn't shake. How long had she been playing this game? And was I just a pawn or something worse? A mirror of her past she needed to silence. At 3:10 a.m., I opened every file I had on Dominic Vale. Timeline gaps, financial trails, flight manifests. But one detail stood out now. He'd once shared a holding company with someone under the alias ELH. I'd assumed it was a coincidence. Not anymore. Evelyn Hart, my mother. At dawn, I went back to the Hart estate. I told the guards I was there to collect old personal belongings. No one questioned it. They still saw me as the failed daughter, soft, harmless. I went straight to the family archives. The air smelled like dust and expensive paper. I found a drawer I hadn't noticed before hidden behind a false panel. It slid open with effort. Inside one sealed envelope, no label, just the initials RH. My father's handwriting and a wax seal I recognized from his old confidential correspondences. I hesitated, then opened it. A letter written in fury. She betrayed me. She moved money without my knowledge, lied about Dominic. I wanted to expose her, but you don't expose your wife when your empire is built on her silence. If you're reading this, Evelyn, then maybe you're the only one left with a spine. I froze. My father had known, but he hadn't acted. Not out of weakness, but out of fear. Not fear of losing the company, fear of her, my mother. Later that day, I installed a small bugging device inside her study disguised as a decorative pen she kept on her desk. I knew she'd never notice. She was precise, but she assumed control meant immunity. I waited hours listening from my phone. Most of what I caught was dull. A call with a stylist, a charity board update. Then around 9:47 p.m., her voice lowered, serious, focused. She's further than I thought. She already owns part of the Vail account. That wasn't supposed to happen. A pause. No, I'll handle her myself. Richard won't intervene. Another pause. Yes, I know what I did. And yes, I'd do it again. I sat in the dark, phone in hand, staring at the floor. There was no more doubt. It wasn't just betrayal. It wasn't just strategy. It was legacy. She didn't just push Dominic out. She destroyed him to make sure no one ever questioned her place behind the Hart name. And now I, her daughter, was the next threat to her throne. I returned to my own office and pulled out a symbol I'd found weeks ago on one of her old notebooks. A simple etched design I didn't understand then. But tonight, it matched the logo on a company I now knew she'd dismantled quietly, brutally, long before I was old enough to understand what hostile takeover meant. I stared at the torn paper in my hand, a chill crawling up my spine. She'd done it before, and I was next. But this time, she didn't know who she was up against. Because I wasn't playing her game anymore. I was rewriting the rules. That morning, I didn't go to war, I paused. I sat still for the first time in months, letting the silence breathe around me like mist. No spreadsheets, no legal briefs, no movement, just a cold rooftop, the sting of wind on my skin, and the kind of quiet that demands you face yourself. Beneath me, the city pulsed, unaware that a storm was gathering behind these calm eyes. I wrapped my hands around a mug of coffee I'd forgotten to drink and let myself sit in the memory of what it once meant to trust my mother, Evelyn Hart, the woman who taught me how to dress, how to speak, how to enter a room and own it with silence. I thought she was elegant. I thought she was distant because of expectations, image, legacy. But now I knew she was watching me, not with concern, but calculation. Not for love, but for the moment I would become a threat. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a photograph I couldn't let go of. My family, the four of us, captured in artificial joy. I had burned half of it the night before. Her side, her smile, her hand on my shoulder, gone in flame and ash. What remained was me alone, and a skyline behind me that suddenly felt more like a promise than a prison. My phone buzzed just after 9:00 a.m. A message, no name, no ID, no trail. Just come alone. 9:30 a.m., Rothman Cafe. Ask for Inez. I froze. Inez Rothman, the former head of compliance at Hartwell, dismissed quietly after she flagged discrepancies in the company's philanthropic fund, a fund managed directly by my mother. I was at the cafe by 9:20. Inez arrived at 9:31. She sat across from me without a word and slid a folder across the table. I opened it and felt my breath leave my body. Bank transfers, internal emails, private correspondence, all tied to a shadow project named Crimson Veil, coded, buried, and signed off by one name, only Evelyn Hart. This wasn't a business initiative. It was a surgical tool used to destroy smaller competitors, manipulate board votes, and above all, erase the existence of one man, Dominic Vail. The man my mother had used then buried. The man my father took the blame for. I looked up and Inez's expression was clear. This was more than a warning, it was a confession. She used me, Inez said. Then she destroyed every trace of me. But I kept this. Just one copy. I nodded. I couldn't speak. Could barely breathe. If you're not careful, she added, she'll do it to you. That night, I walked the city again, not with rage, not with fear, but with the stillness that comes right before everything breaks. I passed Hartwell buildings, glass towers with their polished marble and meaningless slogans. I used to beg for their approval. Now they belong to me, piece by piece, and they didn't even know it yet. I stopped in front of Hartwell Tower and stared up at the glowing windows, the place they thought I'd never belong. And then I pulled out my journal, flipped to the final page labeled Final Targets, and wrote down her name, not Alexander, not Madeline, Elaine, my mother. When I got home, I didn't sleep. I sat at my desk and whispered a voice note into my phone, not for evidence, but for myself. "This is personal," now I said. "Not revenge, not control, but truth. Before I take everything from her, I need to understand why." That's when I noticed it. The door. It wasn't fully shut. Just a crack. A breath of air through the hall. I had locked it. I always lock it. I moved slowly, no lights, no sound, and on the center of my table was an object I hadn't seen in decades, my childhood music box. Pristine, closed, untouched, except for the note taped to the lid. My hands trembled as I peeled it off. Just 8 words written in her perfect script. "You never understood the game, Evelyn. Try me." She had been inside my home. She'd been here, in my space, in my quiet, in the last place I thought was mine. That music box sat in the center of the table like a declaration of war, not just a threat, but a reminder she wasn't coming after me. She was already inside. I didn't scream. I didn't panic. I stood still in the doorway for a long, cold moment, just staring at the box I hadn't seen since I was 7. Its porcelain face still wore the same faded ballerina in mid-twirl. I remembered winding it on the nights I couldn't sleep, how the tune calmed me. Now it sounded like a countdown. The note was taped with precision, her handwriting as elegant and surgical as ever. "You never understood the game, Evelyn. Try me." 8 words that said everything she needed to. She wasn't hiding. She wasn't avoiding conflict. She was inviting it. And I had accepted it the moment I wrote her name on the final page of my journal. I scanned the apartment room by room, but nothing else was touched. That was the message. She could have taken everything, but she didn't. Not yet. My body moved like it was on borrowed air. I sat at my desk, hands trembling slightly, and erased everything on my whiteboard, every date, every strategy, every arrow, because I had just been reminded that I wasn't the only one writing a plan, and now I needed to burn mine. I packed only what I needed: 3 encrypted drives, 1 cash stash, and a single copy of the Crimson Veil documents. Then I walked, not to run, but to relocate, to reset. Because the next moves couldn't be made in spaces she'd already studied. I walked through the city at dawn, anonymous among suits and commuters, until I reached a building no one in my family knew I owned, registered under a false name, paid through shell accounts, guarded by silence. Inside, I accessed a vault I'd built for this exact moment. The flash drive labeled CRV slid into my laptop with a soft click, and the screen lit up with the data my mother would kill to erase. I found something new. A second phase. Phase Dueto's Crimson Veil expansion protocol. This wasn't about Dominic. It wasn't even about me. It was about everyone. This project wasn't a relic from the past. It was active, evolving, and targeting entire sectors: education, tech, medicine. Systemic silencing of competitors, manipulation of leadership chains, insertion of loyalists. A pattern emerged. Every company they quietly devoured had one thing in common: female founders who refused to bow. That was her game, and I had inherited it without knowing. But I wasn't going to play by her rules anymore. I converted the drive stored backups in 3 locations and deleted all local traces. Then I did something I hadn't done in 3 years. I opened a secured call to someone from my past, someone who'd once owed me and who now worked inside Hartwell's IT intelligence branch. His voice crackled through the static. "Evelyn," I didn't explain. I just said, "I need access. Deep archive. Elaine's communications. Unfiltered." He paused. "Then she's going to know." I smiled without humor. "Good." I returned to my new base hours later, eyes dry, resolve hardening. The music box was still in my bag. I didn't open it. Not yet. Some things you leave closed not out of fear, but timing. I pulled out the photo I'd burned halfway and stared at what was left of our family. My father, blind and complicit. My brother, consumed by status. My sister, ambitious but never strategic. And my mother, now fully exposed. She trained me. Every lesson, every silence, every punishment dressed as guidance, it had built the woman I was now. But what she never expected was that I would take those tools and forge something new. Something she couldn't predict. I looked at myself in the reflection of the monitor, tired, steady, sharpened by betrayal. She trained me, I whispered. Now she'll regret it. They never saw me coming. That was the point. They thought silence meant surrender, that absence was failure. But while they drank champagne in boardrooms and clapped for quarterly reports, they barely understood I was building something behind the curtain. And today, just as I stood before the mirror, watching my reflection disappear behind a storm-streaked window, I knew the game was almost over. I leaned back in my chair. No screens, no files, just memory. The kind that doesn't knock when it enters. It started after they pushed me out. Not with anger, but with strategy. I didn't need to fight them in public. I just needed to find the cracks they didn't think mattered. It began small. Vendors Hartwell mistreated, former partners brushed aside, quiet people with loud resentment. I approached them with something simple: stability. I created a holding company, Graythorn on paper, just another firm. In truth, it was my knife wrapped in velvet. Through Graythorn, I bought tiny shares, percentages barely visible. Then came retired executives, silent stakeholders, the ones no one listened to anymore. I offered them more than money. I offered them recognition. And then I struck gold. A legacy fund, one of Hartwell's earliest silent partners, was quietly liquidating their stake. Too careful to go public. Too greedy to resist. I met them under another name, EH Consulting, and they never asked what it stood for. Zurich, Tokyo, Singapore. The fourth meeting sealed it. Their 19% transferred to Shadow Peak Capital, which of course was mine. I now held 41%, and I waited. Alexander's scandal cracked open the board's confidence. The stock dipped. I moved. 2 more transfers, a panic sell, an old ally cashing out. 51%. I'll never forget the moment it happened. I was in a hotel room in Berlin, lights off, laptop glowing. 1 email, 1 signature. A simple confirmation. Shadow Peak Capital now holds controlling interest in Hartwell & Co. No applause, no celebration. Just 1 whispered word in the dark: checkmate. Back in the present, I turned from the window. I could feel the shift in the air, not in fear, but in readiness. I wasn't walking into the boardroom tomorrow to argue. I was walking in to reset everything they thought was permanent. The walls they built with their last names, their suits, their legacy, all of it built on the assumption that no one from the outside could ever get in. But I wasn't from the outside. I was one of them. I just stopped playing by their definition. I pulled out the final envelope labeled Graythorn, final stage authorization. I sealed it quietly, slid it into my bag. Then I took a match and burned the rest. The names of the shell companies I'd used, the fake email addresses, the access cards, the identities I had worn like costumes. All gone, all served their purpose. My mother still thought this was chess, that I was a pawn who'd wandered too far forward. But pawns evolve, and I had become something she could no longer capture. As I sat in the dark screens, dimming one by one, I whispered to the silence, "You never saw me coming." That week, I disappeared. Not physically, no headlines, no sudden vanishings, but internally, I stepped out of the game. Not forever, just long enough to breathe. Long enough to remember who I was before strategy replaced instinct. I didn't wake with fire in my chest. I didn't reach for blueprints or documents or encrypted drives. I woke slowly. My thoughts moved like fog. That was the cost of seeing too much clarity comes with silence, and silence is heavy. I walked through the city unnoticed, faceless, in crowds. I sat in a park and watched families, real ones, laugh, argue live. I saw a father kiss his daughter's forehead. I watched a mother kneel to tie her child's shoe. Small things, unarmored love. I wondered when that stopped existing in my world, if it ever did. For a while, I believed power meant control. Now I saw how hollow that control felt without connection. My mother had shaped me into something sharp and precise, but maybe not human. Somewhere along the line, I stopped asking why and focused only on how. How to win, how to outthink, how to dismantle. But now, under the ash of everything she'd built, I found fragments of myself she hadn't been able to rewrite. Quiet things. The part of me that still remembered lullabies. The part that still knew my father once hummed when he read. I returned to the estate one night not as a warrior, but as a daughter searching for answers I didn't expect to find. The place was empty. My footsteps echoed through marble and regret. In a study drawer, I found an old family journal, one I'd forgotten existed. My name was there in my father's handwriting. Pages filled with notes about me, about who I was before they tried to shape me. "Evelyn has vision," he wrote once. "But she doubts it because none of us know how to see her." I cried then. Not loudly, not for long, just enough to feel the weight slide off my shoulders. I had spent years trying to prove I wasn't weak, but I had never allowed myself to just be hurt. That night, I burned the pages of a different notebook, the one filled with her tactics, her venom. I watched the flames curl around the edges of every plan she'd etched. Crimson Veil, Phase RC2, contingencies, backup routes. I let it go. Not because I had forgiven her, but because I had outgrown her. She still thought this was a war. She still believed I was her reflection. But I wasn't. I was what she feared most. I was free. That pause didn't mean surrender. It was preparation. Because even a storm breathes before it breaks. I didn't announce my return. I didn't call ahead or schedule a meeting. I simply arrived uninvited, unannounced, and entirely in control. Hartwell Tower looked the same from the outside glass, polished to a sterile shine. Receptionists rehearsing smiles, board members rushing past like their suits were stitched with purpose. But when I walked through the revolving doors, everything felt different. Not for them, for me. The last time I stood in this lobby, I had been dismissed in a whisper. Today, I walked like silence itself had changed sides. I took the elevator to the executive floor. My badge had been reactivated. Someone inside was already bending. The doors opened to a hallway I once feared. Now it felt narrow, smaller, like it had shrunk to fit me, not the other way around. I passed portraits of past CEOs, men in suits, women in pearls, all staring like they mattered. But the future doesn't bow to frames. The boardroom was full. They didn't expect me. A few turned. My father's eyes widened. Madeline froze mid-sentence. "Alexander." He stood as if unsure whether to defend his title or surrender it. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't smile. I walked to the head of the table and placed a single folder down. "Restructure proposal." "This is not a request," I said softly. "It's an inevitability." No one moved. I own enough voting power to force change, but I prefer clean transitions. Alexander scoffed. "And who gave you that power?" "I took it," I replied, silently, efficiently, while you all clinked glasses. I opened the folder and revealed performance reports, internal audits, executive expenses, the rot beneath their luxury. I suggest everyone reads their section carefully. I handed Alexander an envelope. Performance review. He looked as if I'd handed him a death certificate. My father cleared his throat. "Evelyn, this isn't how." "How?" What I interrupted. How Hartwells do business. Because from where I'm standing, business was the excuse. Control was the goal. He looked down. For once, he didn't fight. I turned to Madeline. "No one is exempt. You taught me to be ruthless. You'll now see how far that lesson went." She didn't speak. She only looked at our mother, who stood in the glass office adjacent, watching everything. No panic, no anger, just stillness, because she knew. This was no longer about revenge. This was about replacement. I closed the folder and looked around the room. "This isn't a takeover," I said. "It's a correction." Then I walked out. I didn't wait for applause. I didn't need it. In the elevator, I closed my eyes. The hum of the cables felt like breath deep, certain real. No adrenaline, just precision. The clarity that comes not from winning, but from knowing you were never meant to lose. Downstairs, I stepped into the light. Hartwell Tower shimmered behind me, no longer a monument, but a reflection. I didn't need to scream to be heard. Because power, when real, moves in silence. I didn't need a grand finale. I didn't need fireworks or applause or some climactic declaration of victory. When you've already won, the silence becomes the celebration. That morning, I dressed with purpose, not armor, a black suit, clean lines, no jewelry. I didn't need sparkle to be seen. I walked into the final board meeting not like a returning rebel, but like a woman who never truly left, only evolved while they weren't looking. The room was waiting. Papers shuffled. Eyes avoided. My name now appeared first on the printed agenda, Evelyn Hart, chairwoman appointed. There were no congratulations, just unease. My mother sat at the far end of the table, poised, controlled, her hands folded over a blank notepad. No defiance, no welcome. Just a stillness I now understood wasn't elegance. It was strategy. One last shield before the fall. I walked past her without pause, without a glance. That war had already ended and she knew it. I stood before the screen and began without ceremony. This company was built on legacy, but it will thrive on merit. Slide after slide, I dismantled the old order, not with cruelty, but with clarity. I presented the new structure, the new vision, a leaner, modern Hartwell, promotions based on data, not bloodline, benefits tied to innovation, not last names. Each board member received a sealed folder labeled Exit Strategy. Some would stay, most would not. Not because I wanted to hurt them, but because I no longer needed to protect them from the world they helped create. Then I turned to my father. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't quote the past. I simply placed a hand on his shoulder. He looked up, eyes glassy, with something between shame and reluctant respect. He said nothing. He didn't have to. My mother didn't speak. She rose from her seat, collected her pen, and left the room. She passed by me without touching, without trembling. But in her eyes, I saw it. Not defeat, but recognition. She had trained me. Now she understood the cost. When the room emptied, I stayed behind. For the first time, I sat at the head of the table, not as a symbol, but as a decision. My hands rested lightly on the oak surface that had once felt too large, too cold, too distant. Now it felt mine. I walked through the halls of Hartwell Tower one final time, not because I was leaving, but because I was done needing it. I no longer needed this place to know who I was. On the rooftop, I stood in the sunset. Wind tugged at my coat. I looked out at the city not as a battlefield, but as a canvas. In my private office, I closed the final file. One last folder, one last name crossed out. The Hartwell logo reflected behind me on the glass wall. It was still there, but it no longer owned me. And then I left. I didn't look back. That evening, I sat by a window in a quiet apartment, a warm cup of tea in my hand, rain beginning to whisper against the glass. No fanfare, no headlines, just peace. They once called me a failure. Today they call me chairwoman. Tomorrow they'll call me the one who rewrote everything they believed about power. But me, I just call myself free.